the design thinking process starts with empathy, and then it's basically the scientific method after that. And until I started teaching the design thinking process, I never thought about the empathy part and how important it is for me to understand what you need as opposed to, I'm just going to make stuff, right?
Tell
And
me
so,
more about that. Say more about the empathy and that scientific or the sort of inquiry-based creative process. Like
yeah.
tell me more about that.
So it's important when we're a designer to not just design and be, a creator in a vacuum, because that's nice, right? Like a lot of things come out of art studios if people are just creating, right? But creating with purpose is what design is about, right? And in order to be able to design something for someone to use, we need to understand what they need. And so, having an empathetic conversation and going, okay, what do you need? What's the problem? What problems do you have, right? And I've got solutions already on the shelf that I could pull off and give you, but that's not necessarily going to meet what your need is. And I can help you with maybe a logo for your podcast or something like that, and I got to figure out who Morgan is and what Hindsight 101 is all about, and get into that to figure out, well, what colors could we use and how does it represent what you need?
Hi, it's Morgan Michael, and this is Hindsight 101, where you're going to get practical strategies for designing a life that inspires you, one life edit at a time. Hello, and welcome to Hindsight 101 with me, your host, Morgan Michael. I'm here with Bryon Carpenter, and he is the host of Fresh Air at 5. And Bryon, I just want to welcome you to Hindsight 101 today.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks for having me on Hindsight 101.
Nice. Well, I know that you are a huge fan of podcasts, and you've coupled this, and I'm a big fan of wellness. That's what I present about. That's what I've written my book about, and then also belonging. But I love how you tie wellness, so walking in the morning, with learning. And so tell me a little bit about how Fresh Air at 5 came about.
Well, it was one year that we had our anniversary dinner, and then that evening my wife and I, my wife goes, we should get gym memberships. So we went to the gym and we got gym memberships, and then I kept going to the gym and she stopped going to the gym, and I was there at 5 a.m. every morning when the gym opened, and I would run and do weights, and if it didn't work out, I would, be 10 minutes late, and it would mess up my morning because I got small kids at the time, and, being home for family time before school and all that stuff was really important. So I said, what can I do that's different than doing this? And I'm like, well, I live on a hill. I live on a hilly neighborhood, and I got running shoes. And so I stepped out the door, and I'm like, well, I don't want to listen to music. What can I listen to? And I started listening to podcasts, right? And there was podcasts that I started listening to that were not necessarily, like I didn't have the same repertoire I do now. It was like This Week in Google and some other tech things, but not educational technology. And so I started doing that, and one thing led to another that I kept walking, and I'm like, hey, I need to connect with the podcast host because, I like what they have to say, and I would like to let them know that I think about them, right? And so I started tweeting a picture of, my reflection, and, on Twitter and doing that. And then one time someone said to me, you can do a video. And so I started doing a selfie video and reflecting that way. And then that led to the podfather, Chris Nessie, talking about me on his podcast, going, Carpenter, you need to start a podcast. And I'm like, about what? And he goes, exactly that. And so one thing leads to another, that my podcast is a collection of my reflections in a week, or maybe two, depending on how lazy I am or how busy in life, full life is, But I do the reflections, and I get some exercise while I'm breathing fresh air. We live in a beautiful place here in British Columbia in Abbotsford, and I walk in the morning. Right now, it's just all dark all the time, but there's nobody else around, and it's quiet, and I listen to my podcast there. And so it just gets me some exercise, not crazy exercise, but it's better than sitting on the couch. And I do some learning at the same time. And I find that for me, my auditory learning is really important for me. For me to read books, I'm not a big book reader, but I can take in a lot of content through my ears in this dedicated time frame in the mornings. And then I reflect on them, and that gives me the content for my podcast. So it's like metacognitive.
I love that. And it's like such a good experience. Not only that, but it's also like an example of actual lifelong learning, which is what we hope our students will become, right? As
Right.
lifelong learners. So
Yeah.
you're walking the walk literally. And I love that. So I think it's a really cool way to digest content. I'm kind of like you, Bryon. Like I can pick up a book, but I like to kind of sift through to the important parts. I love nonfiction content. And so
Mhm.
I feel the same. I love hearing the author talk about their ideas in really unfiltered ways. I mean, obviously they train a little bit, and most of them in terms of, the content that they want to put out and the stories and all of this. So there's a nice, strong framework.
Yeah.
But I love hearing it from their voices and from their actual, perspectives. So I'm right there with you. And I really love the tie-in of the wellness. When you think about this whole thing that started, how many years ago did you say?
I started hashtag Fresh Air at 5 in April of 2019. So I'm like, who's allowed to start a hashtag? And I'm like, well, I think I can. And so I did. Not that anybody uses that hashtag, but me.
Yeah.
And then I got the name at Fresh Air at 5 on Twitter and all the other places. But it started with that. And it has evolved since then from being me just like listening and doing a visual, like a text-based reflection, to more an audible, it's a video, right? And so my podcast is the summation of all the audio all week. But if you want to watch me walk and talk, you can do that on Twitter every day, because the dailies that I do, the stuff that I listen to every day, like this morning I listened to 2 podcasts, and I had 4 segments of about 2 minutes and 20 seconds that I put out on Twitter, in a sequence, and then those become the audio for the whole podcast in the week. It's developed and evolved over time, right? I take and use Spotify as a playlist creator. So I go get, your podcast when I listen to it. I go get the other podcasts that I listen to, and I put them into a playlist so that you, Morgan, can go and listen to what I listen to get my reflections, if you would like, And
Yeah.
so it's not that the listenership is huge, but it's more about a discipline for myself, that I'm doing this for me, and it provides an opportunity to connect with people that, when you become a podcaster, it gives you kind of another level of street credibility.
Absolutely.
That you can go and just go, hey, I'd like to talk to you, right?
Yeah.
That's how we're talking right now, is because you reached out and said, I'd like to have you on my podcast, and I could be on your podcast, but unfortunately my podcast isn't like that. But I'll listen to your podcast all the time and talk about you, right? So,
which is awesome. No,
yes,
it's awesome.
Yeah. And so the evolution of it, it's about networking with people. It's about I found over the past 4 years that there would be times when I would go through like content cycles of things that I would listen to. I started listening to educational technology about Google Slides and, Google Drawings and all that kind of stuff. And then, I was like, look, I can't just listen to ed tech all week. I got to listen to teacher wellness. And so then I
Right.
started listening to Teachers on Fire and Teacher Stories and things like that. And like your podcasts about, how do people tick? Right. And because I think if we just talk about the content or the educational technology part, we're missing the rest of the humanity of it,
Yeah,
And
I totally agree.
And we're users of technology, and human beings are users of this tool that we have access to, And in the past 2 years, I did a lot of listening about artificial intelligence, as we all are hearing, or we should be hearing. And I've done a lot, like nearly all my learning about it. I've read a few books, but by listening to authors and people on podcasts talk about their experience and how do they do prompt engineering and things like that. And that's provided me an opportunity to, go to places like the Ministry of Education, last February, to talk about AI, because they had some questions for teachers, right?
Nice.
But if I wasn't doing this learning and having these cycles where I learn about a certain topic for a while and then I change to another topic. And, if you look at my titles, you'll see a lot of AI in the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't there before because ChatGPT didn't make its debut
Mm-hmm.
until then. But, I find that the content that I talk about is, a mix of wellness and about, leadership, courage,
Mm-hmm.
artificial intelligence and ed tech. And, I want to present myself as a lifelong learner. And if I'm just going to stay with one thing, then that's not me being a learner, right? I can't listen to all of it, but I can listen to much of it. So,
and you're like a curator. So I think
yeah.
that's a great, segue into, because I think talking about the evolution of your actual podcast, what it started as, what it's become, I think there's sort of an accountability factor too. But yeah, let's talk about some of the topics that you've been interested in. So with AI, this has been an interest of mine as well. I think people have sort of two opposite approaches to it. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what you think about that. They're either scared about it and afraid to sort of toe dip into it because they catastrophize what might happen as a result of inviting this into our daily life, right?
Yes.
Fair.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, there's sort of an open-armed embrace of this new technology without maybe necessarily asking critical questions. So from an educator standpoint, because we know this changes the game, whether we want it to or not, AI, the advent of this kind of technology has absolutely, undoubtedly changed the game for us. So what is Bryon Carpenter's view on AI, and what do you think we should do?
All right. So, there's the scared or the open arms, and it might appear that I'm very open arms about it, but I'm not. We need to be critical thinkers today more than we ever have been, because the amount of media literacy and media that's coming at us, just through un-AI means is a lot. And then you pile on all this generative AI content that is so easily made that we have to figure out whether that's true or not,
Yeah.
And I think as an educator, my job is to expose my students, and I teach middle and high school students in our building here, this physical building. I teach at an online school, so I work with chemistry and math students outside of that. But the in-building students, it's my job to inform them about things that they don't know about, right? And or to talk about things that they think they know about, and to have conversations about that, right? And so, am I concerned about AI in our education? I am, because if we don't learn about it well, and what it can do and what it can't do, and where we as humans should be involved in it, I think we're doing a huge disservice to our students to say, oh, it's nice, it'll help get you answers, and it's always right. It's not true. It's not true, right? Yeah, so I would say I'm probably on a scale of 10, I'm probably like an 8.5, you know? And I thought I was like a 9.5 or a 10 when I started with this journey with my students about a year ago. A year ago in October, I started teaching my middles and high school students about, AI literacy and like, what is AI? And digging into those things. And I was like, oh, and as I started learning about it myself, I started listening to more podcasts that informed my thoughts in the classroom. And I had my students, I said, okay, we're going to now talk about, where do you stand with AI? Are you on this side or that side or somewhere in the middle? And they're like, Mr. Carpenter, what do you think? And I said, you know what? After all this that we've learned about, I would say I'm probably an 8.5 out of 10, and not 100% in, because
why is that?
We have to be we have to be wary about what it does and does not do well, right? AI with confidence will give you an answer every day of the week, all the time. Every time you ask it a question, it will give you an answer. Now, what do you do with that answer? Do you just go, yeah, that's great, or do you have to go and corroborate that with actual facts?
Yeah. Because
it's just making its next best guess about what the next word could be based on everything it's read. But is it thinking? Well, no, it's giving you the next best guess. Right? Is AI wise? No, it's not wise. Who's wise? We're wise, right? And we need to be confident in the fact that we do think, and that we can learn, and we can use this tool as a thought partner, but don't use it as a replacement for me in my brain. Right? Because there's never going to be a brain like Morgan's and Bryon's. Right. And everybody else is listening to this, that, we have a very special thing inside our heads that is amazing. And yeah, maybe AI knows more things than our brains can know, but that doesn't mean it's wise, right?
So what do we do then to create, or do you have any frameworks, or do you have sort of rules or sort of things that guide students in terms of how they can use these things?
Yeah, well, there's a framework, at the Ministry of Education that in British Columbia here, and there's a poster about AI usage in the classroom space, right? And it's not a set of rules, right? It's not policy that the ministry has written, and I'm glad that they haven't written policy, but they've given us some guidelines to think about, right?
Great.
And if you've been teaching digital citizenship I hope teachers are teaching digital citizenship skills. It's very much like that. So it's not a huge change, but it's about, you need to give reference to where did you get this idea from? Like if you sit down and use, Gemini or Copilot or ChatGPT and you ask it a question, it comes up with this brilliance. It's a good idea actually to change it and modify it yourself so that you're confident with what it says. But then at the very bottom, say this was generated with ChatGPT, using this prompt, right? Because I think it's kind of like revealing, the wizard at the Wizard of Oz, right? Like, the guy behind the curtain pushing the buttons and doing that. And we need to be critical thinkers in how we ask questions of it and how can we modify those responses so that we can get better responses back and then be the human before it goes out, right? Being responsible for what comes out, right? And if we put our name on a paper and, we don't say that we use ChatGPT, we're cheating, right?
Yeah.
And that's not right, okay? So there's those kinds of things. And then there's the environmental things. This is like, I'm just looking at this from an educational perspective as opposed to like AI in our world and how it's affecting our world, right? And I was bugged at first when I started hearing about the harms of AI, right? And I called them the potential harms, but no, there are harms. There's with any technology, there's going to be harms, right? And we need to be aware of what those are so that we can effectively not say we're not going to use it, but we're going to be aware of it so that we can, use it efficiently. Right?
Yeah.
And don't just use it because, we're not going to go and turn on our gas car just because it burns gas and that's what we want to do. Well, go places, go do things if, use the tool for good and as opposed to just using it to waste away our environment, right?
Is burnout, overwhelm, and low motivation holding your team back? Well, I help people like you in education, the corporate world, and in healthcare to regain a sense of themselves through simple life edits. All you have to do to transform your team is contact me for your next workshop or keynote. Let's talk a little bit about creativity within this, because I think that this is an easy way to dovetail that concept as well. I think that, we wanted to talk about creativity, and I think creativity is probably that. I often say that creativity is a big part of burnout mitigation. People kind of go, what do you mean? But I think that creativity is our most human, most sort of wholesome expression of who we are as human beings. And so if we can express ourselves not only through like art and painting and music and those types of things, but more through the way that we interact with people, the way that we garden, the way that we decide to, throw together a party. Like we have all these different creativity types. How do we tie the essence of who we are into the work that we do?
By being creative. And so when I was growing up, I grew up in in the city, and I was a good student, and I was became a scientist. And it wasn't until I was in my, probably 4th or 5th year of education, and I've been doing this for 16 years, that I thought about myself as being a creative person, right? Because I was always like, creativity is about, being an artist and expressing yourself that way, or painting or playing music and singing, right? And being an expression artistic person like that, right? Performance arts, for example. But then I looked at how I am creative, and I am creative with technology to solve problems, right? How can I take a technology that says it can do this and this and this, and I find another way that I can use that, right? How can you use a spreadsheet when you're in the, high school youth group, right? Well, you can put everybody's names on there with their phone numbers, and you can print it out, and everybody gets everybody's phone numbers, and we're doing networking, right? But someone never thought about that before, right? And so that's a creative outlet, right? That happened when I was in high school many years ago, but I was like, that's not really creative. That's just using an Excel spreadsheet. But that is creative, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that we can express ourselves and help others because of our humanity, right? Because of our desire to solve problems and listen and, be empathetic so that I can hear what you need, Morgan, and how can what I know how to do help you and hear back from you what you can do for me, right? And so there's empathy involved in that because we're human beings, and the design thinking process starts with empathy, and then it's basically the scientific method after that. And until I started teaching the design thinking process, I never thought about the empathy part and how important it is for me to understand what you need as opposed to, I'm just going to make stuff, right?
Tell me more about that. Say more about the empathy and that scientific or the sort of inquiry-based creative process.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
So it's important when we're a designer to not just design and be, a creator in a vacuum, because that's nice, right? Like a lot of things come out of art studios if people are just creating, right? But creating with purpose is what design is about, right? And in order to be able to design something for someone to use, we need to understand what they need. And so, having an empathetic conversation and going, okay, what do you need? What's the problem? What problems do you have, right? And I've got solutions already on the shelf that I could pull off and give you, but that's not necessarily going to meet what your need is. And I can help you with maybe a logo for your podcast or something like that, and I got to figure out who Morgan is and what Hindsight 101's all about and get into that to figure out, well, what colors could we use and how does it represent what you need? And then, from that conversation, I go back to my drawing board and I go, okay, I'm going to come up with this, and this. And I go, okay, Morgan, what do you think about this? And you go, oh, no, not that, right? And as a designer, to stop from being offended that I did all this work and you don't like it, right? I'm a freelance designer. I don't get paid for any of this, right? So I guess freelance is the wrong word, but I'm an amateur designer, right? So I design stuff, and as eventually it gets to the point where you're like, that's exactly what I need, right? And I can help you get to a thing, and then I move on to the next project and thinking about, who else can I help, and having those real human conversations that drive our creativity more, right? And I don't know if I said that well. So
I think so. I think that makes sense to me. So I think when you think about creativity, like in your own life, but extrapolating to the value of it for other people, especially in education, what would you say that, doing the podcast, doing the designs, even designing lessons and things, what kind of fuel does that give you? Because my argument would be that the more that we're curious, the more that we explore novel experiences in our life, and the more that we invite things that feel maybe a little uncertain, maybe even a little scary, nerve-wracking, that enrich and, it makes our life richer, and that we get something out of that. What do you think about that?
When I can create something and design something for like a lesson in class, and then it's an experiment. Every time you make the great lesson, you go to class and you hope it doesn't flop. But if it does, you got to go back and say, why did it flop, right? And not being offended that nobody liked my lesson. Why didn't they like their lesson? Well, maybe there was a thunderstorm outside when it was going on and they were distracted by the weather, But it brings me great joy and satisfaction that I am making a contribution when I'm able to be creative in this manner, and I'm able to serve my school community with my creativity and help solve problems. And, students were having hard time getting into their locker since September. And so what I do today, I went and made a selfie video of me talking about how to get into a locker in a tutorial. Boom, just like that, right? Because I have the tools and I know how to do that. and my colleagues, they solve problems and they're creative in different ways than I am.
Yeah.
And I understand that, what they do is not greater or lesser than what I do, but we can complement each other. And you got a whole bunch of creative problem solving people in a room, you can actually make a difference, right? And so that's where our team of creatives is really important, and understanding what each person can bring.
I think that's so great. When it comes to some of the podcasts that you've listened to, what are some of the ones that are sort of top of mind in terms of the ones that you love to listen to or that you'd highly recommend?
Right. Okay. So depending on the length of time I have to walk, that affects kind of what I listen to. There's one podcast called Teach Happier with Suzanne Daly, and she's out of the States, and she has about a 7 to 12-minute podcast once a week talking about something about a small shift that can make a big difference in your life as an educator, right?
Nice.
And it's a small concept, but she talks about it for a brief period of time. And that's really affected my outlook as I go into my week, or even from that moment forward. And, listening to it on a regular basis, you're like, yeah, that's actually connected to this over here. And she said that like 6 months ago. And oh yeah, that brings to mind, right? And one reason I podcast is so I have a log of what I've listened to.
Nice.
Okay. My show notes are my log of what I've listened to, right? And so that's one selfish reason why I do this, is so I have a record and I can go back and find that episode, maybe, that I remember it was in June and around this time, and I can go look for it and find it, right? And go back and listen to it. So that's important. So Teach Happier is a good one. I recommend that to people to listen to. It's got some good wellness in there. There's Evolving with Gratitude with Lainey Rowell, and she's out of California. And she talks about gratitude and how important gratitude is for us in our health and wellness. Because without being grateful, it's just a constant level of stress all the time and unhappiness. And that is not good, as you know. That, if we're unhappy, we're not healthy, right? And so,
Correct.
And sustaining that for too long is not great. We can have conflict, but we got to figure out a way around that conflict and looking at what the good things that are going on. So there's that. Other podcasts that are great, educational podcasts educational technology podcasts. I listen to the EdTech Throwdown with Eric and Nick out of Pennsylvania, and they bring the EdTech magic, and they talk about actual pedagogy with the educational technology, and not just using it for technology's sake, but what tools could you use to do project-based learning with your students, at different levels, right? They teach high school, so it's a lot of high school level things, having the tools and knowing about the tools, right? If you don't know all the wellness practices out there and you've got your one that you talk about, that's not being open-minded and being a learner, right? And so same thing with educational technology. So there's that. I've got a lot, Morgan.
Yeah.
You can go to my show notes and you can go look through them, and there's a lot that I enjoy, but I like the balance of teacher wellness ideas and humanity involved in education and the technology part.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's great. And I think those are some names that maybe, whether our audience is familiar with or not, it's good confirmation, right? If we're listening to that already, or you maybe haven't heard these names, good to have that as a perspective. Right. So just being cognizant of time, Bryon, what would you say is a message, at this point, that you'd like to wrap up with for educators right now, as we, it's November-ish right now. By the time that this podcast comes out, it's probably January. It's kind of dark and dreary. Yeah. What would you say to educators right now?
I would say that you got to take care of yourself and don't let yourself, get into a slump. Do things for yourself that are good for you. Like me going for my walk in the morning, truth be told, I struggle sometimes to get out of bed, but as soon as I'm like 5 steps out my front door, I'm like, yes, this is good, right? And so getting fresh air and keeping on learning, like keep that learning going on, right? If you're not learning something every day, I say that you're not living, right? You gotta learn something every day, and I pay attention to things that you can learn in your days, right? Learning about your students, learning about something that you can use to help them, or learning about something in a book or that you didn't know, right? And doesn't mean that, you have to like learn 55 things a day. Just pay attention to learn one thing and be grateful for those things that you're learning.
And I think that's so great, Bryon. And I'd like to say just how important when we think about our emotional needs, like I often talk about emotional needs. So we have a need for certainty. We have a need for variety. We have a need for belonging. We have a need for significance, to feel important.
Yes.
And then we have a need for growth and contribution. And when I think about all of the things that you do with Fresh Air at 5, and then your ability to share that out with your audience, and then your ability to bring that back into the classroom, I think you're hitting all of those things. And when we're doing that, right, it's like you're filling your emotional bucket. So that's huge. It's huge. So thank you for that example. I think it's great.
You're welcome.
And I just want to thank you so much for jumping onto Kindsight 101. Where can people find you?
People can find me on Twitter, X. So I actually heard it called Twix, TWI, right? So it's a combination. I'm not going to let go of the Twitter because I was a Twitter guy long before it turned into X, right? So you can find me there at my own name, which is at Bryon Car, BRYONCAR. That's me every day. And then I also have at Fresh Air at 5, all one word. That's there. You can find me there. I'm not on Instagram and Facebook and doing all the things because I'd like to, but I don't take the time to, right? Because there's other things that are super important to me, like my family and going fishing and, my community around me. And for me to do all the things, I don't. So I do have a personal Facebook page. I don't connect with a lot of people there. So best way to find me is actually on Twitter. So yes, jump on Twitter and say hello.
Perfect.
You can DM me and ask me questions, or just follow the content and keep up with Fresh Air at 5.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bryon. I appreciate the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you, Morgan. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Kindsight 101 with me, your host, Morgan Michael. It has been an absolute pleasure. I always learn so much, but really, I want to hear what you've learned. Please find me on social media by searching Morgan Michael and reach out. I always love to hear from people.